Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, The Introduction to the ENERGY STAR Portfolio Manager Building Emissions Calculator, Part 2. We'll be getting started in about 5 minutes. As you're joining, there's a quick pre-webinar polling question in the polling panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you have a moment to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation of the Introduction to the ENERGY STAR Portfolio Manager Building Emissions Calculator, Part 2. We'll be getting started in about 1 minute. As you're joining, we have a quick pre-webinar polling question in the polling panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you've got a moment to fill it out before we get started, we would really appreciate it. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar, The Introduction to the ENERGY STAR Portfolio Manager Building Emissions Calculator, Part 2. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to address. First, you can submit questions to the Q&A portion of today's presentation by sending them in the chat, which you can access by clicking on the speech bubble icon on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Please send these in as they come up to you so we can get to more of them during the Q&A. Second, we'll be sharing a link to the recording and the presentation slides with all the folks who registered after the webinar. Now I'm going to hand things over to Andrew Schulte and Cindy Jacobs for today's presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. This is Cindy Jacobs. I am I'm with EPA. I'm the Chief of the ENERGY STAR Commercial and Industrial Buildings Branch. And I just want to take a quick moment here to welcome everybody, to thank you so much for joining today's webinar. We're very excited to have you and to share this new tool with you. I want to say just a couple things at the outset. One is that as of now, the Energy Star Building the Energy Star Portfolio Manager Building Emissions Calculator is available only for U.S. buildings. We are very interested in expanding to Canadian buildings in coordination with our partner, Natural Resources Canada, in a future update. So look for that being available going forward. But as of now, again, let me reiterate, it's just available for U.S. buildings. Now, some of you on today's webinar may have already gone in and checked it out, and we are glad that you have, and we'd love to hear whether you have or not. It's been mentioned a couple times. We have a poll that's live right now. You can click on the polling option on the right hand of your screen and just let us know whether you have checked out the tool. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Schulte from ICF, who is going to be running today's training.
Great, and thanks so much, Cindy, and thanks, Alice, for queuing everything up today. As Cindy noted, my name is Andrew Schulte. I am a support contractor working in support of EPA's Energy Star program. So I'm thrilled to be here with you today and to dig into the functionality of the new Portfolio Manager Building Emissions Calculator. I'm going to go ahead and bring up our agenda for the next hour or so. But before I do that, Alice, can you give me a sense of what kind of polling response we've received so far?
Yeah, so it looks like most folks who are on the line have not yet used the calculator.
Okay. Well, certainly, if you have not responded to the polling question, please go ahead and do so. We just want to use that as kind of a barometer for the interest, not just the interest in this tool, which you've expressed by being here on today's session, but also to get a sense of who has already gone in and started playing with this tool. We did, 2 weeks ago, we presented part 1 of our introduction to the Building Emissions Calculator. That was more of a high-level tool intended to give some background on why the tool was developed, what it's intended to achieve, various use cases envisioned for the tool, how the tool interacts with other EPA resources. If you were on that call and you came to join us for part 2, thank you so much. If you were not on that call on May 10th, you can access a recording of that session from our WebEx page. So we certainly encourage you to do so. I'm going to spend just a few minutes up front recapping sort of the most important high-level points to contextualize why we developed and launched this new calculator tool. But then the bulk of our time today is going to be spent walking through in real time via screen share the use of the tool. And so we're going to broadly identify, background context and new features of the calculator. And then we're going to walk through the process of getting your building data into the tool, using the core functionality of the tool to estimate your annual emissions using a couple of different calculation methodologies. We're going to talk about how to use the tool to forecast future emissions. We're going to show you how to get data out of the tool. And then finally, we're going to try and leave a healthy chunk of time to go through any questions that come in from the audience. So by all means, as you go through this presentation, if you have any questions that pop up, please send them through to the host via the chat panel on your WebEx interface. With that, let's get started. So a few high-level items to discuss. So when we talk about greenhouse gas, I'm sorry, I promise I can talk today, greenhouse gas calculations in Portfolio Manager, let's focus on what Portfolio Manager is currently doing today. So if you are tracking GHGs in Portfolio Manager, the tool is calculating metrics for your direct emissions and your indirect emissions, and then adding that up to get your total GHG emissions. So what's the key differentiation here? Well, direct emissions are related to the on-site use of primary energy products like natural gas or fuel oil. Basically, any fuel product that you purchase in order to combust on site to operate your building, those are direct emissions. Indirect emissions are those related to the purchase of a utility supplied energy product. So most commonly that's going to be grid electricity and also other district fuels that you purchase from an off-site provider like district steam, district hot water, district chilled water. Those are indirect emissions. So taken together, direct plus indirect equals total greenhouse gas emissions. There is some crosswalking of direct and indirect to different scopes of emissions in formal GHG accounting, but we're going to kind of slide past that today because we just want to focus on what Portfolio Manager is doing. Now, when we talk about indirect emissions, there are actually two approaches to calculating indirect emissions. One is what we call the location-based method, and this relies on grid average emissions factors for the region of the grid that your property is, where your property is located. And this uses regional factors from EPA's Emission and Generation Resource Integrated Database, or eGrid. And so basically, the Portfolio Manager looks at your zip code, maps the zip code to an eGrid subregion, and there is, one greenhouse gas emissions factor for electricity per subregion. There is also a method called the market-based approach, and this allows users to use energy supplier-specific emissions factors. So this approach allows users to consider power purchase agreements or other contractual arrangements where an organization that owns buildings, buys power from suppliers. And that could be fossil fuels, that could be renewables. But the idea is if there is a contractually delineated, emissions rate that goes with the energy you are purchasing, that is something that would be recognized through the market-based approach to indirect emissions calculations. And since 2015, the World Resources Institute, which publishes the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, has required that organizations use both the location-based method and the market-based method for calculating indirect emissions. Well, that's important to know. It's also important to know that as of today, the current approach for the calculation of indirect emissions in Portfolio Manager is really associated with the location-based method, right? So again, your building has a zip code. The tool looks up the zip code. It identifies what region your building falls into, and it assigns a subregion-specific emissions factor for grid electricity. Now, okay, so that's that is an area where Portfolio Manager hits on one element of greenhouse gas reporting, but does not necessarily provide the full picture. So what are some considerations around the location-based approach? Well, as we described earlier, it doesn't really differentiate for scenarios in which there are documented local grid emissions factors that are different from the eGrid subregional factors. Similarly, it may not allow you to reflect the impact of procurement decisions that you've made to source a lower emissions electricity product. And also the calculation logic behind the location-based approach does not explicitly recognize the role of off-site green power as a zero emissions fuel source. So that those differences between the location-based approach and the market-based approach are one aspect of the functionality that EPA wanted to integrate and provide to its users through the building emissions calculator. This slide here provides a little bit more detail as to the primary differences between GHG calculations in Portfolio Manager and the building's emission calculator. So here, just going through this quickly, Portfolio Manager does use at any given time, it only uses the most current eGrid emissions factor for your building, whether you're requesting metrics for the current year or a prior year. The building's emissions calculator is a little bit more fine-grained, so it allows you to align an emissions factor with the specific year of the data that you're running through the tool. As we just noted on the prior slide, in terms of how the building emissions calculator calculates your indirect emissions, Portfolio Manager is pretty much just location-based. The building emissions calculator allows for both location-based and market-based calculations, as well as an additional functionality specific to local jurisdictions, which we'll talk about in a little while. Portfolio Manager is really focused on historical and current performance. The building emissions calculator will allow you to forecast future anticipated emissions based on a couple of user-based assumptions, which we'll discuss. The other thing to note as we wrap this up is, Portfolio Manager is accessed through a username and password protected database. So you can go in, you can make updates, and you can return to your data later. At this point in time, there is no login required for the building emissions calculator. However, that means that your data are not saved between sessions. So we'll show you how you can get data out of the tool to review later, but currently it's not possible to go into the building emissions calculator and then save your progress and come back later. But those are the main differences that we wanted to outline. And with that, we wanted to jump into an actual demonstration of the tool. So let's do that right now. I am going to share my screen. And we are off. Alice, can you just confirm for me that my screen is showing up?
Yeah, you are good to go. We can see the calculator's homepage.
Perfect. All right, well, let's do it then. All right, so let me bring my notes over to a different page. Sorry about that. All right, here we are. Anyway, the building emissions calculator now has since it's in launch, it has a page to itself. From anywhere, I'll just show you where you can navigate to it from the EnergyStar.gov homepage. You go to commercial buildings and then go down to resources by topic. Right up here under the B's, you've got the building emissions calculator. Okay, and it can also be found from the resources by topic accordion drop down on the left-hand nav bar of any of the Energy Star buildings web pages. So this is a landing place that describes the building emissions calculator. It also provides a means to get access to various help resources and documentation. You see right here, you can click on emissions calculator help, and that will bring you to a page that has a very detailed user guide, a glossary, technical references about the calculations in the building emissions calculator, in addition to existing technical references on the treatment of green power and greenhouse gas emissions in Portfolio Manager. Finally, there's a dedicated link to contact our help desk to ask any questions that you may have about the building's emissions calculator. But to really get started,
Is it possible to zoom in a little bit?
Yes, absolutely.
Chat asking.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We'll have to see how that happens when we actually pull up the calculator itself because of the way that frames are lined up, but we'll figure that out. So to get started, you can go right into this link here that says use the calculator. And that's going to take us to this main page right here. It says building emissions calculator. And the first step here, the first thing that you'll do is choose an option by which you want to get your data into the building emissions calculator. Now, for reasons that we went into a little bit in the May 10th presentation, right now the building emissions calculator is a standalone tool. It does not exist within Portfolio Manager. So that means that if you want to use the tool and you're benchmarking your data in Portfolio Manager, we've created a couple different ways to get your data from Portfolio Manager into the building emissions calculator. Essentially, we don't want you to have to re-enter any data that you've already entered into Portfolio Manager. I don't want to spend more time than necessary talking about the data import options, but I also do want to give everybody a sense of what's available, because there was a good amount of time spent on making this as user-friendly as possible. So let's walk through quickly the 3 different data import methods. Basically from left to right, option 1 here on the left actually allows you to reach directly into your Portfolio Manager account, select your buildings, and ingest their data into the buildings emissions calculator. Option number 2 leverages the pre-existing reporting functionality within Portfolio Manager. That allows you to actually run a report in Portfolio Manager, export it as a spreadsheet, and then upload it to the building emissions calculator. And then finally, if you want to use the building emissions calculator for a property that hasn't been benchmarked in Portfolio Manager, there is a manual data import option. And we're going to walk through all 3 of these. I did want to point out, though, that for any of these options, the accuracy of the results are going to be based on the accuracy of the data you ingest. So if you have a building in Portfolio Manager that has been incompletely benchmarked, then just understand that the results that come out of the building emissions calculator will also be incomplete. All right, well, with that said, let's go quickly through these different import methodologies. So the first one is the direct import from Portfolio Manager. If you click on that, it's going to ask you for your Portfolio Manager username and password, the same credentials that you use to access your Portfolio Manager account. When you enter them in and click Submit, that happened pretty quickly. The building emissions calculator tool is going to reach directly into Portfolio Manager, and it is going to pull out the complete list of buildings that you have in your account. Now, this is my test account for training, so I only have a limited number of buildings. If you have a Portfolio Manager account that has thousands of buildings, please note that they're all going to display here. So it can get a little bit difficult to navigate if you've got hundreds or even thousands of buildings. So that's a case when you might prefer to use data import option 2, which we'll talk about in a moment, because there is more extensive filtering and sorting and selection opportunity available in Portfolio Manager to limit your building search. But nevertheless, you go into this page, it will show you every building that's in your Portfolio Manager account, and then you have the option to select up to 50 buildings. And as Cindy noted, right now, only US buildings are going to return results. So I'm going to go through, I have 2 sample buildings that I want to use here. So you go ahead and you select them. Again, you can select up to 50. Then you click this button up here, Get Building Dates, which takes you to a second screen. So once you've selected your buildings, you then tell the tool how many years worth of data for each building you want to import. And to help you do this, the tool will show you kind of the date range for which complete data exists for your building. So you can see here that for one building, I've got complete data from 2017 through 2020. For another building, I've got complete data for 2017 through 2021. So what this tells me, I'm going to go in and I'm going to choose data for the 4 years for which both buildings have complete data. I could choose 2021 as well, and it would just show a gap in 1 year for one building. But right now, I am requesting 4 years of data for each building. As you know, in Portfolio Manager, every metric is denominated by a 12-month ending date, so you have to choose the month as well as the year. In this case, I'm going to choose December, so that for each of these years, I've got calendar year data. However, if you are working on a non-calendar year fiscal calendar, you could conceivably select September or July, or, June, or whatever works for your organization. So when I submit data, I have ingested the records for these 2 buildings, so 4 years of data each for 2 buildings, and it has been ingested into the tool, and you can see that that worked because data are showing up in the Building Emissions Calculator tool. We're going to come right back to this tool in just a second, but before we do so, I want to show you the other data import approaches. So let's go back to this main page. All right, the second approach that we discussed, which may be most useful for those of you who have really large portfolios and really like the filtering and group functionality in Portfolio Manager. If you choose this, a dialog box is going to come up, and the first thing it's going to do is tell you, hey, go to Portfolio Manager and access this report template. It's a direct link. When you click on it, if you're already logged into Portfolio Manager, it will take you right to the report. If you're not logged into Portfolio Manager, it will ask you to log in, and then it will take you directly to where you need to be. So no need to hunt around. Click on the link, enter your user credentials if necessary, and then it will take you to the report. So there is a dedicated Building Emissions Calculator import template that EPA has set up as a standard report in Portfolio Manager. So all you need to do is select the date range and properties for which you want to generate this report. So in this case, I'm going to say date range. I'm going to choose a yearly reporting interval, and then I'm going to select December 2017 through December 2020. And as you can see here, that will give me 4 calendar years of data, 2017, 18, 19, 20. You can go in here and select which properties you want to put into this report and thereby ingest into into the Building Emissions Calculator. Here I've chosen the same 2 buildings as I sampled before. When you're done, you click Generate Spreadsheet. It'll take you back to the Reporting tab of Portfolio Manager, where you can access the Building Emissions Calculator import that you just generated. You go here, you click Download Current Report in Excel. And it will download wherever you've set up your web browser to download files from the web. And what you will get is a report that looks like this. If you're familiar with all other reports you can get out of Portfolio Manager, this should look pretty standard, okay? This is a spreadsheet template that has been set up so that it can be easily ingested back into the Building Emissions Calculator. Okay, great, we've got this. What do we do now? Well, you go back into the Building Emissions Calculator, right? Remember, this is the dialog box from which you went to access the template before. You come down to your computer, you select the file you want to import, and then you upload it. And there you go. Now, you may not remember this, but this is the exact same visual that we got when we used import option number 1, because I'm getting the same data 2 different ways. So I just wanted to point out that there are multiple ways to get data into the tool. The final one that I want to point out, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into super great detail, but if you have buildings that are not currently benchmarked in Portfolio Manager, you can click on this 3rd option, enter the data manually. From there, you can download a special Excel template. Okay, it's a macro-enabled Excel template that looks like this. And what you will do is you will go through and you will enter in basic information about your property. Let me just throw in a few example pieces here. And we have set this up so much as with Portfolio Manager, you can capture any fuel consumption that takes place at your building across any one of these fuel types that you see here. You can choose the billing units, and then the only important thing to know, the main thing to note here is that you need to provide annual consumption. So the 12-month consumption for each fuel type for the period ending the date that you have specified. So let's just dump some data in here. So I'm just making up some data. But the thing here is you can enter one building at a time, but you can manually import multiple buildings. So the way you would do that is you would enter data for one building, and then you'd click this button that says done with this entry. And then you would go on and you would add your second. And between every building, you would click done with this entry. And what that does is that queues everything up over here to be ready for import into the tool. When you're done entering your buildings manually, you click done with this entry for the final time, save the file to your computer, and then you'll come back and you'll choose your file. You'll choose the manual import that you saved to your computer, and you'll click upload. Maybe I chose the wrong one. There we go. And in this case, I only entered one building, so of course this doesn't show up as a line. This shows up as a dot on the graph. But that's the third, the manual-based approach to getting data into the tool. I know we all want to see the tool, so I don't want to go too farther into detail. The Building Emissions Calculator user guide has step-by-step guidance on how to use each one of these upload methodologies. Again, though, the idea is that whichever approach you take, it gets the data into the Building Emissions Calculator, so then you can use the core functionality of the tool. So let's go back and use this first pathway. Let me just redo what I did a few minutes ago. I'm going to select my two sample properties. I'm going to say I want data for calendar years 2017 through 2020, and I'm going to click Submit Data. All right, here we are. I kind of spoiled the reveal because you already saw this 3 different times through 3 different import methods, but now we can really talk about the tool itself. So this is the Building Emissions Calculator, and it consists of 2 main parts. So up top, you've got a graphing module, and below this, you've got the data table. So the data table are the details that at any point in time define what's shown up here in the graphing module. We'll discuss each in turn. So because it's up top, let's talk about the graphing module first. So this is the default view when you come into the Building Emissions Calculator. The default is a building view. So what that means is for each building that you have selected for import into the calculator, you will see a time series where you've got 1 line per building with as many dots on the graph as you have as the 12-month period ending periods that you've period ending dates that you've selected. So in this case, these are annual December 2017, December 2018, December 2019, December 2020. And up here you can see that we remind you that you chose December as the month associated with each year. So this is a time series. This allows you to see how each building's emissions sort of tracked out over time. There is an alternate view, so this is the building view. You can also toggle a portfolio view, which instead of being a line graph is a bar graph that just gives total greenhouse gas emissions associated with all buildings that have data for a given year. In terms of further graph customization, you'll see that there are a couple toggles that you can select. So working from right to left here. So the first thing is, by default, every year that you selected for import will show up on the graph. But if you just want to focus in on 2 years, for example, you can do that. You can, in real time, adjust the number of observations that show up on the graph in terms of years. You can also choose to show all buildings at one time or just one building at a time. Okay, so those are some pretty simple toggles for buildings and years. There's another toggle also for emissions metrics, and I wanted to get to this last because there are a lot of options. Okay, as we discussed, part of the value of the building emissions calculator is that when calculating your direct and indirect emissions, it calculates different flavors of those emissions. So you can see here that, as we talked about a couple minutes ago, your indirect emissions can be either location-based or market-based. And therefore, your total emissions can be based on the calculation using location-based indirect emissions or market-based indirect emissions. So every permutation of emissions calculation is available to you here. And because these are all separate calculations, the graphing functionality will only show one metric at a time. Okay. Now, you may have noticed here there's this group called locality factors. Okay, so what does that mean? Because that's not location-based or market-based. As we'll see in a minute, locality factors are meant to account for jurisdictions that have or will have building performance standards in which they have actually specified the emissions rate that must be used in achievement of a building performance standard. Right now, the only local jurisdiction that has done so is New York City. And so we have in the tool allowed for building owners in New York City to easily indicate that they want to see their metrics using the New York mandated emissions factors. I'll show you that in just a second. But it is kind of a third flavor. So we've got location-based, we've got market-based indirect, and then we've got these location or locality-specific factors. So a lot of customizability in this tool. Let's show you how you can use that. So scrolling down here to the data table, all right? So this data table, at any point in time, this is going to dictate the summary results in the graph above. When you first ingest your data into Portfolio Manager, it is going to create one line of data for each 12-month period for each property that you imported into the tool. So if you recall, we chose 2 buildings with 4 calendar years of data each, and therefore we've got 8 lines of data, 4 each for 2 different buildings. And the default calculations that you'll see in this tool default to using a location-based calculation. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, when you first come into this tool, the results you see here should be, with the exception of a few rounding errors, should be pretty close to what Portfolio Manager is spitting out. Okay. The way you get further specificity from here is based on the use of the customization features of the tool. One thing I did want to show you first, though, is if you ever want to confirm what data points were ingested for each building record, all you need to do is click on the building name. And this, we call it a drawer, will pop up. And it will show you exactly what was imported from Portfolio Manager, and therefore what is driving the calculations in the tool. Okay, so at any point in time, you can double check what data came into the tool and what data are underlying the calculations performed by the tool. All right, so let's talk about adding custom factors. So by default, the tool is providing you the location-based greenhouse gas emissions, right? It doesn't have any data yet or any information yet to apply a market-based calculation. So you'll see here that location-based and market-based are equal, right? That's intentional, that's by default. So let's say that you want to apply, let's say for our two buildings here, that in the most recent year, 2020, these two buildings had actually sourced 50% of their electricity from a supplier who had a documented lower emissions rate than the grid emissions rate. Okay, how would we account for that? Well, first, you would choose the records in question. So I'm going to choose the 2020 record for each of my two buildings. Oh, let me scroll down a little bit more. All right, so I'm selecting those two buildings. Then I'm going to go up and I'm going to click Add Custom Factors. And now you get this dialog box. So you'll see here that this is expandable. So you have options to provide market-based custom emissions factors for all of the indirect fuels: electricity, district steam, district hot water, district chilled water. For the sake of simplicity, let's just say we're just dealing with electricity. So what did I say? I said 50% of the electricity use, and let's say that this supplier has a documented verified emissions factor of 70 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per MBTU of electricity. That we know that is lower than the location-based rate. If you have multiple custom factors, you can enter them all here. But once you've entered them in, for each one, you would enter percent of electricity that gets that custom emissions factor, and then the custom emissions factor. You click Submit, and now you'll see that for these two records, this column here says, yes, a custom factor has been applied, and the font changes for these files, or for these values, because you can see that there is now some separation between the location-based metrics and the market-based metrics. So unsurprisingly, we see now that the indirect and total greenhouse gas emissions figures are a little bit lower when you use the market-based calculation compared to the location-based calculation. And that's because the location-based calculation is applying one emissions factor to 100% of the electricity. The market-based metric is reflecting the fact that half of your energy consumption in this case had a lower emissions factor. Okay, so this allows you, and again, the WRI greenhouse gas protocol says that indirect emissions should be calculated using both methodologies. So this is a quick way to get these values using both methodologies. Once you have applied a custom factor, if you click back on this information for or on the specific building record, you'll see that that information is now here and is editable. So if you want to go, oh, actually, nope, that's not true. It wasn't 50%. It was 40% of my electricity came from this market-based contract. And actually, the emissions factor was 75, right? You just make that edit here and click Submit, and it updates in real time. All right, so the other approach for customizing your data. So what happens if you've got buildings that are located in a jurisdiction that actually specifies the emissions factors you should use for your building. Well, in this case, I've got this second building here, copy of sample office for BEC testing. I know that this building is located in New York City. So you know what? I want to go apply the New York City locality specified emissions factor. So I'm going to choose all 4 of these options, and I'm going to come back up here, and right next to the Add Custom Factors button, I'm going to click Add Locality Specified Factors. Right now, the only option in this drop-down list is New York City. These are the factors published as part of Local Law 97. We anticipate adding additional cities with additional locality specified factors in the future. But right now, this is really only useful if you have buildings located in New York. But I selected 4 buildings. Let's apply the New York factors. And great, when we scroll back down here to our data table, you can see that these columns over to the right that deal with locality specified factors, now these 4 buildings are showing results because we have applied the locality specified factors for these building records for a building located in New York. All right. So those are the different ways in which you can apply custom factors to your 1 or more building records. And remember that each record, each line represents 1 year of data for a given building. If you make any mistakes and you need to reset, you can always click reset and it'll ask you what you want to reset. If you want to wipe out everything, you just you click on reset both factors and it'll set everything back to where the data were when you first ingested them. Now, I mentioned before that the building emissions calculator does not allow for saving data. However, you can export any and all calculations that you perform in the tool. You do that by clicking this download link, and it's going to download an Excel file that looks like this. So it's a multi-tab spreadsheet file. The first tab is basically going to be a copy of the data table from as it looked at the moment you click download from the building emissions calculator. Okay. For building details, this is going to output the building details that were ingested into the building emissions calculator for every record for every building. This third tab here will document any custom emissions factors that you have applied to your building record. Okay. And then finally, as a reference, this final tab shows you all of the emissions factors for every fuel type and every electricity subregional grid, all the emissions factors that are used in these calculations. So again, you can't pick up a session where you left off, but if you want to document the results of this tool, you can dump out all the data and all the calculations into a spreadsheet. All right, so that's what you would do to calculate your current and historical emissions using the building emissions calculator. Let's talk quickly about how you might forecast future emissions, because this is really a cool feature of this new tool. So let's click over to the second tab, right, the emissions forecast tab. Now here, instead of having 1 line per year of data per building, what it's going to do is it's going to start with 1 line of data for each building you ingested into the tool. And as you'll see here, the line of data selected is the most recent year of data for each building. So in this case, you'll remember that I ingested 2 buildings with data going from 2017 to 2020. But for the purposes of forecasting our future emissions, the baseline, the starting point is the most recent record, so calendar year 2020. And the information you see here is carried right over from the prior tab. Now, let's talk about applying forecast assumptions. So you would select each building for which you want to forecast future emissions. And you would click this button here, Add Forecast Emissions. All right. Here comes a dialog box where you can interact with the tool in various ways. First things first, you have to choose a forecast date. There's a little date picker. At this point in time, you can only choose one forecast date, one future date for each building. That's something that could potentially be tweaked in the future. But let's just say that for both these buildings, I'm going to set my future date as calendar year 2040. Okay. Now, the tool is going to ask you to indicate how your building might have changed between now and 2040. So if you bring this down, you can say, all right, on average, these two buildings, we're getting about 63% of their energy from electricity, and the rest was from non-electric fuel sources. Well, in 2040, I believe that both of my buildings are going to be all electric. So let's move this slider all the way to 100%. All right. Anticipated reduction in site energy use. In short, energy efficiency. How much reduction do I think I will be able to get for both of these buildings between now and 2040? Well, I'm going big here. We've got some major energy efficiency goals. So I'm going to say that right off the top, we're going to improve the energy efficiency of each building by 30% between now and 2040. All right, a few other questions to answer. What is our anticipated use of off-site green power in 2040? Well, all right, right now we're looking at about 5%. Let's say that in 2040, we're going to be purchasing 20% or 20% of our energy consumption, our electricity consumption will be associated with off-site green power purchases, you know, whether that's bundled green power or whether those are standalone RECs. All right, how much renewable energy am I going to generate on site for these two buildings? Well, again, let's say that we've got some, you know, some lofty goals for 2040. 25% of our electricity is going to come from on-site renewables. Finally, do we have any insight as to what we think the grid emissions factor might be in 2040? Well, we don't know, but let's say we can have it, you know, in the next 20 years. All right, great. So we have now input 5 different assumptions to define how we think our buildings will look in 2040. Now, if you don't have any assumptions to apply, or you don't have, you know, data for all 5 of these, that's fine. You don't have to apply assumptions, but I'm using this opportunity to show each of the assumptions. So you would put those in using the slider or data input on this last one. You click submit, and boom, the tool has calculated your forecast data for 2040 for each building, and it has added that to the graph up top. And unsurprisingly, if all of those assumptions hold true, we're using all electric, we're using less energy, we're using more renewable energy, and the grid emissions factor went down, well, it's unsurprising that we would see these emissions drop. But again, this is something that you can go back to, and if you want to fine-tune any of these, you can click on the building name, and you can tweak your input assumptions. And that will reflect both in the data here and the data in the graph. And I will note that just for the sake of simplicity here, I applied forecast assumptions to both of these buildings at the same time, but both here and on the other tab, you can certainly choose to apply your forecast assumptions one building at a time. Or if you have many buildings in this tool, you could choose some subset of them to apply forecast assumptions to. So it's you know, there's a lot of ability for customization here. As we discussed before, there is the option to download your forecast data from this button right here on the side of the screen. The forecast spreadsheet, actually, it's color-coded, so blue means current and historical, orange means future. And you can see here, it's a multi-tabbed spreadsheet that will show you the results of the data table, so the calculated emissions results for the forecast date that you've chosen. And then Also, there's a tab that will document the selections you made for each building. And what's nice about this is it will show what the quote-unquote baseline period was, and then what your future assumption is for each of the 5 variables. All right, so that was a whirlwind tour through the tool. I believe that is every function of the tool. So what I am going to do now is I am going to return us to the main presentation. And we're just going to jump quickly to, there are a lot of slides in this deck. Let me find the, all right. Here we are at the recap. So over the last 45 minutes or so, we've learned about core functionality of the new calculator. We've talked about the various ways of getting data into the calculator. We've talked about how to use some of the finer grained functionality of the tool to apply custom emissions factors in a few different configurations. And then we talked about using forecast assumptions to calculate estimated future emissions. And in doing so, we've gone from A to Z through the entire functionality of the building emissions calculator, from how to get data in from Portfolio Manager all the way to outputting, downloading spreadsheet files that document the calculations of the tool. At this point, we are going to spend some time on Q&A now. I did just want to share that we have some pretty extensive help documentation, including various technical reference guides, user guides, glossary. One thing I did want to call out is our Energy Star help desk. We do, within the help documentation, there is actually a dedicated link where if you click on it, it will take you to a help desk ticket that's pre-filled out with the subject building emissions calculator. So if you have any questions about how to use the tool, any comments about its current functionality, any requests for future functionality, we absolutely encourage you to write in to the help desk, send us a ticket, we'll be logging that information. And as necessary, if it's a question about current functionality, we will respond to you, or somebody from the Energy Star team will respond to you. So all of these links are hyperlinked. So in the slide deck that you get following this session, all of these links will be clickable. The other thing I want to note, you'll see up here that there were, I don't know if you can see it in your view, but this is about a 50-slide deck. That's because we have screenshots that walk through all of the content that I provided live. So even though we were live on my screen showing me walk through the building emissions calculator, all of those major steps are captured in screenshots here to help remind you of how we walk through the tool. So hopefully that will be useful. Again, you should get these slides as a follow-up to today's session, so either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. And of course, there's also extensive documentation in our user guide and technical reference documents. So with that, we're going to go spend some time looking at the questions that you have asked throughout the day today. So it is currently 2:55. That is actually about on track. The session is scheduled to go through 3, but we are going to stay on the line until about 3:15. So if you have a question that you urgently need answered, or would like to hear our answers to other people's questions, please stick around. We're going to get through as many as we can in the next 20 minutes. If you have any burning questions that we don't get to today, or you got to leave in 5 minutes and can't wait around, please do send in a question to our help desk, energystar.gov/buildingshelp, reference the building emissions calculator, and send in your comment or your questions, and they will either be noted and added to our wish list, or we will respond to you as needed. So again, we may not be able to get through every question in the next 20 minutes, but we'll do what we can. And Those of you who still have questions, please do send them in via the chat panel to the host, and we'll capture them and get to them if at all possible. All right, so let's do this. I'm just looking down. We've got about 15 questions, so we'll see what we can get through. Alice, just to give me about 30 seconds to take a sip of water, can you tell me if there's been any uptick in the polling numbers and what things are looking like now?
Yes, it still looks like most folks have not used the tool yet. Looks like about 70 people on the line have not, and about 20 have. And if you're talking, Andrew, you're muted.
I understand that they were they were answered directly by our session host, directly via the chat panel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify questions that were not yet addressed, and then if we have time, I'll come back around and ask out loud some of the most common questions for everybody. Okay, are you planning to add this calculator to Portfolio Manager in the future? That is a great question. Short answer is if market demand demonstrates that there is great uptake of this tool, then certainly that would direct EPA to examine integrating this tool into Portfolio Manager. I know that sounds wishy-washy. I mean, I can't say anything for certain, but basically, yeah, we want to understand the greenhouse gas calculations that are most valued by our stakeholders, by building owners, operators, and other users of the calculator. And certainly, where appropriate, we want to augment Portfolio Manager's greenhouse gas inventory and goal-setting capabilities with those features. So, we're really keeping a close eye at on how much uptake there is of this new functionality. Again, there's a lot that EPA wants to do with the Portfolio Manager tool. So, if there's overwhelming use of the building emissions calculator, that might support its integration into the Portfolio Manager, the primary Portfolio Manager tool. But we're keeping a close eye on usage statistics and really interested in hearing how our various stakeholders are using the tool. All right, here's a good question. For custom emissions factors, when determining the percent of electricity receiving a custom emissions factor, should you be using site or source energy? Short answer there is you should be using site. So, for example, if you have contracted, and I realize no calculation is going to be as simple as this, but let's say a building uses 100,000 kilowatt hours of electricity in a given month, and you have contracted with a supplier to get half of that, 500,000 kilowatt hours a month, from a dedicated lower emissions supply. You would kind of do the math offline, and when entering the percentage of electricity use receiving the custom emissions factor, you would enter in 50%. We understand that this is not always going to be a straightforward calculation, but generally speaking, we expect that you should have the ability to enter that information with some reasonable degree of specificity. Obviously, if that is an assumption we've made, if that doesn't bear out in reality, if there are things that would make it more difficult to be able to specify that percentage of a given fuel type that should get a custom emissions factor, by all means, that's feedback we'd love to hear. But yeah, you should go based on basically billing quantity. Use, for all things having to do with, greenhouse gas emissions, the energy units that this tool is concerned with are the source energy units. Sorry, I misspoke. The site energy units, the amount that's showing up on a bill, the amount you are purchasing from the supplier. If you apply NYC factors, will the spreadsheet show NYC or the actual value applied? That is a great great question. I will actually share my screen again quickly so I can show you what this looks like. So this is the spreadsheet that comes out of the building emissions calculator. Again, if you have applied a emissions factor, a custom emissions factor, it will show up here. If you go to the third tab, custom or locality factors, it will show you if you have applied a custom emissions factor or a location-based, or a locality specified factor. And you can see in this last column here, data source, it will tell you if you have applied a locality specified emissions factor, in this case, New York City LL 97, it will say that. So, yep, great question. And the answer is, these spreadsheets do delineate what location specific locality specified emissions factor you have selected, if any. All right, so there's a question asking us to repeat how many years out can be input for the forecast. Again, at this point in time, you can only specify a single forecast year. That is, something that we can look at as a potential enhancement for the future, right? The ability to delineate more than one forecast year. But right now, the idea is that you can ingest any number of timeframes, annual timeframes for current and historical data for up to 50 buildings. And then for each building, right now the tool allows you to designate one future year for forecast purposes. And again, that year can be the same for all your building records, or you can set different forecast years for different buildings. All right, so next question has to do with, I believe that this is asking about, our definition of green power and whether or not, what happens if you're purchasing 100% green power through your provider. That's a really good question. This bears a little bit of detail. So as you probably may not remember 45 minutes ago, but in Portfolio Manager right now, you have the ability to designate your consumption of grid electricity, your consumption of your consumption of grid electricity, your consumption of on-site generated renewable energy, and your consumption of off-site green power, right? And off-site green power is most typically it's going to take one of two forms. It's either going to be a direct bundled green power purchase, say from your utility. Maybe your utility offers the ability to, pay a premium to guarantee that 50% of your electricity is going to be renewably sourced. Possibly you've got a contract from another provider to deliver you X% of green power across a given time period. Or it's possible that you aren't purchasing a bundled green power product, but rather you are purchasing unbundled renewable energy certificates, or RECs. all of that functionality currently exists in Portfolio Manager for you to specify that. The challenge, however, is that the location-based approach to greenhouse gas emissions doesn't actually treat off-site renewables as a zero emissions source, right? Actually, for your total emissions, it uses the grid emissions factor for that energy consumption, because with off-site green power products, you're still getting the electrons through the grid. And there's no way to determine, whether each electron was renewably sourced, because it all comes from the grid. So, in Portfolio Manager right now, if you've got off-site green power purchase, that's being reflected in your greenhouse gas emissions through a separate metric called avoided emissions. But for the purpose of total emissions, off-site green power is treated the same as as grid electricity. That is different in the building emissions calculator. In the building emissions calculator, if your data in Portfolio Manager reflects that you are getting some percentage of your electricity as an off-site green power product, the building emissions calculator will account for that as a zero emissions fuel source when calculating your market-based emissions. That is already baked into the tool. So if you're capturing your off-site green power in Portfolio Manager, it's going to show up in the building emissions calculator as a market-based number. So what I would say is, if you are benchmarking your building in Portfolio Manager and you are basically you have a contract to where 100% of your electricity consumption is confirmed as being off-site renewable electricity, then you should use Portfolio Manager to say that 100% of each electricity consumption record is off-site renewable or off-site green power. If you do that in Portfolio Manager, that will already be taken into account when the building emissions calculator runs your data. This can get a little bit tricky. This is discussed in more detail in our user guide. And to this individual attendee, if you want to discuss this further, please by all means send in a question to our help desk. Can the anticipated off-site green power use be used as a proxy for local clean energy? So, for example, in Seattle, Seattle City Light is known to be, the energy it provides is sourced from, a higher percentage of renewable power than, maybe other utilities in the state or in the subregion. How would you account for that? I would actually not suggest using, the way I would account for that is I would use the custom factor functionality there. And that's actually a perfect example for when you would use custom factors. You would go in here and you would say, okay, let's say you have the documented grid emissions factor associated with electricity from Seattle City Light. And let's say all you're consuming is grid electricity, but it comes from Seattle City Light. Well, you would come in here and create a custom factor where you say 100% of my electricity should be associated with this custom emissions factor, and you would enter, the factor you would enter would be the published, verified factor that Seattle City Light has provided. So in this case, the customization here would be the difference between your location-based emissions based on the eGrid subregion where Seattle is located versus the more customized emissions calculation associated with your utility provider's documented emissions factors. So hopefully that makes sense, but that is an example of exactly where a user might want to use the custom factor functionality of the building emissions calculator. Okay, does the spreadsheet show a comparison between current and forecast emissions? Short answer here is no. This is just a facet of how the tool was built. Right now, the data in the tool are separated into this first tab, emissions baseline, which handles all historical years up through the current period. And then the emissions forecast tab presents, the data for whatever single forecast year you've chosen for each building. To make the download process as easy as possible, each tab has its own download functionality. Now, the good thing, though, is if you look at each output, if you look at your emissions baseline tab from the blue spreadsheet, right, your current and historical data, and then you look at the emissions forecast tab, it's basically the same data fields. So you should be able to, if you wanted to create your own Excel file, you could basically merge the two of these together and just add each one of these forecast records to the, to the larger data set that you've got from your current and historical observations. Obviously, this is a really good example of a nice-to-have functionality that would, enhance the tool and its usability for users. So we can, add that to our list, sort of better merging of these two data sets. But right now, that's how I would do a comparison of current and forecast emissions. The other thing I would note, of course, is after you've set your forecast date, if you come up to the graph, right, the graph, at any given time, the graph is going to include any observations for every building record, be they current, historical, or future. So the quick answer to your question is, if you want to see the comparison between current and future, look at the graph. And if you mouse over the data points on the graph, you can get that information. But if you do want to have it in a spreadsheet that can, facilitate offline graphing, the way to do that might be to, merge the two download files that you get from the tool. All right. Just looking down. All right, there's an item that says, we've also purchased, what about custom emissions factors for direct emissions sources, right? So right now, if you go to add custom emissions factors, you'll notice that the only factors that you can apply, the only fuel types for which you can apply custom emissions factors are your indirect fuel sources, electricity and district fuels. We do know that, there is, the opportunity in some regions to access, biogas or essentially, other forms of direct fuels that may have a lower emissions factor associated with them than the national default for those direct fuel types. At this point in time, there is not an opportunity to apply custom emissions factors for direct fuel sources. And the short of this is, right now the market-based calculation methodology for greenhouse gas emissions is focused on indirect fuel sources. So, the four fuel types you see here. Certainly, it is on our list to consider in the future whether we would want to allow for the application of custom emissions factors for direct fuel sources such as biogas or other similar products. But at this point in time, that is outside the scope of the tool. Okay, for forecasting, can the baseline year be changed, or is it always the most recent year of data? Great question. In short, it is always going to be the most recent year of data. So if you ingest 4 years of data for a given building, 2017 through 2020, the baseline, or the jumping off point, if you will, for the forecast will be that most recent year of data, 2020. If you wanted to kind of work around that, you would just need to limit the most recent year of data for which that you're importing into the tool. So let's say you've got data from 2010 through 2021, right? And you've ingested all of those years into the tool. What happens if you want to base your forecast on, use 2020 as the jumping off point rather than 2021? Well, to do that, you would essentially need to select 2020 as the most recent year when you ingest data. So you would need to choose not to import data for 2021, because the tool will automatically, for any given property, the tool will look and say, what is the most recent year of data we have, and what and use that as the basis for future calculations. Obviously, though, this is something to add to our list of considerations for the future. Whether there's an opportunity to apply a little bit more customization to the specific observation year that is being used as the baseline. So thanks for bringing this up. All right, final question, because we're right at time, and I think that is the final question that came in. Let's see, any plans for a similar calculator for transportation for municipalities? Really, right now, the scope of our focus, in line with the scope of portfolio manager, we've really been focused on the energy consumption associated with the operation of a building. So we recognize, of course, that organizational greenhouse gas accounting certainly looks at other emission sources outside of the building, including transportation. But that is outside the scope of this tool. We would certainly encourage you to check out EPA's Center for Corporate Climate Leadership. In particular, they have a tool called the Simplified Greenhouse Gas Calculator, which is a more expansive calculator intended to bring in all elements of a greenhouse gas inventory. So not just your building energy consumption, but also transportation, waste, water, other things outside or beyond the emissions associated with the energy used to operate that building. And I see that we just got a question, a request to share that calculator. I'm just going to quickly simplify greenhouse gas emissions calculator. Let's see if this gets me right. Yep, here we go. I'm going to drop this into the chat. Give me one moment, please. Where's the chat? Everyone. There is the link to EPA's Simplified Greenhouse Gas Emissions Calculator. All right, so with that, I think we have actually responded to every question that came in. I know a number of these questions were answered directly, via the chat window with the attendee. But as of this point, I believe we have responded to all outstanding questions that were sent in to us. So we thank you for those who have stuck around. It does look like, about a third of the attendees at today's session stayed with us all the way through now. So thank you so much. If you do have any other questions, by all means, submit them to our help desk, energystar.gov/buildingshelp, and we will do what we can to get you a timely response. We thank you for spending your time with us today. We know we covered a lot, but you will be getting slides, backup slides for you to review at your leisure. And there is also extensive technical documentation on this new tool. So we thank you for your enthusiasm and for giving us a portion of your day. We look forward to hearing your feedback, comments, questions about the Building Emissions Calculator, and we certainly look forward to seeing you on future Energy Star trainings. So for now, we will say thank you. Hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Till next time, bye-bye.